Epicurus is one of the most misunderstood names in philosophy because his reputation travels faster than his actual argument. For many people, his name immediately suggests pleasure, indulgence, comfort, the idea that the good life is simply about enjoying yourself as much as possible. He is treated as the philosopher of luxury, the intellectual defense of pleasure-seeking, almost a refined justification for hedonism. That image is convenient, but it is mostly wrong. Epicurus did not advocate excess. He was not arguing that the best life is the one filled with endless stimulation, wealth, or sensory indulgence. In fact, he was suspicious of exactly those things. His philosophy is far more restrained, almost surprisingly austere. He believed pleasure was the highest good, yes, but by pleasure he meant something very different from what most people assume. He meant the absence of disturbance. Not excitement, but peace. Not intensity, but freedom from unnecessary suffering. The ideal state for Epicurus is not constant pleasure in the dramatic sense, but tranquility, a condition where pain is minimized, fear is reduced, and the mind is no longer trapped in restless desire. His goal is not luxury. It is calm. At first, this sounds much more sophisticated. Instead of chasing pleasure endlessly, you remove the conditions that make life miserable. You simplify. You stop confusing stimulation with happiness. You learn to distinguish between necessary desires and artificial ones. Food, friendship, safety, peace of mind, these are enough. Beyond that, much of what people pursue only creates new forms of anxiety. This is one of Epicurus' strongest insights. He understands that desire often expands faster than satisfaction. The more you organize your life around acquiring, achieving, and consuming, the more unstable your peace becomes. You do not become free by having more. You become dependent on maintaining more. In that sense, restraint is not deprivation. It is protection. That argument still feels powerful because it cuts directly against modern life. Most people are taught to think happiness is located in the next thing, the next achievement, the next level of comfort, the next recognition. Epicurus exposes how endless that structure becomes. If satisfaction always depends on what comes next, then peace is permanently postponed. You live in anticipation rather than presence. So far, his philosophy feels almost undeniably correct. The problem begins when tranquility becomes not just a goal, but the dominant standard for evaluating life. Because once peace of mind becomes the highest good, everything that threatens peace starts to look suspicious. Ambition becomes dangerous because it creates instability. Deep attachment becomes risky because it creates vulnerability. Conflict becomes something to avoid because it disturbs inner calm. The philosophy begins to sort life according to one central question. Does this preserve tranquility or disrupt it? That sounds reasonable until you notice what gets excluded. Many of the most meaningful parts of life are disruptive by nature. Love is disruptive. Commitment is disruptive. Creating something difficult is disruptive. Standing for something that matters often requires entering conflict, not avoiding it. The pursuit of tranquility can protect you from suffering, but it can also protect you from intensity, from transformation, from the kinds of experiences that make life feel significant rather than merely comfortable. This is where Epicurus becomes more complicated, because his version of peace is attractive precisely because it reduces suffering. But suffering is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is the cost of caring deeply. Sometimes disturbance is not a problem to solve, but evidence that something matters enough to unsettle you. If tranquility becomes the highest principle, then there's a risk of confusing safety with fulfillment. You begin optimizing life for stability rather than depth. You avoid situations that threaten emotional balance, even when those situations are also the source of growth, intimacy, or purpose. You become protected but narrower. Epicurus would argue that much of what people call purpose is simply disguised restlessness, and often he would be right. Many ambitions are driven by vanity, comparison, or fear. Many desires are inherited rather than chosen. His philosophy is valuable because it forces that examination, but it can also move too far in the opposite direction. Not every difficult pursuit is an illusion. Not every disturbance is unnecessary. There are forms of dissatisfaction that point not to greed, but to genuine aspiration. There are pains that should not be eliminated because they belong to love, responsibility, and moral seriousness. This is where the misunderstanding reverses. People think Epicurus was too indulgent, when in fact the stronger criticism is that his philosophy can become too cautious. It protects peace so carefully that it risks shrinking life around it. Instead of excess, the danger is reduction. Life becomes manageable, calm, and rational, but perhaps also less vivid. That is the tension at the center of Epicurus. He correctly sees that endless desire destroys peace, but he may underestimate how much meaning sometimes requires disturbance. Once you accept tranquility as the highest good, your entire understanding of success begins to change. You stop asking whether a life is impressive, ambitious, or socially admired, and start asking whether it is psychologically stable. Does it produce peace, or does it generate unnecessary disturbance? That shift is powerful because it cuts through a great deal of cultural noise. It forces you to examine how many of your goals are actually yours, and how many are inherited from competition, status, or fear of being left behind. Epicurus is unusually clear on this point. Most people do not suffer because they lack necessities. They suffer because they have trained themselves to need what is not necessary. They confuse comfort with dependency, admiration with worth, stimulation with happiness. The more those false needs multiply, the more fragile their peace becomes. They are not free because their well-being depends on conditions they cannot reliably control. This diagnosis remains deeply persuasive. Modern life is built on manufactured dissatisfaction. Entire systems depend on keeping desire slightly ahead of fulfillment. You are encouraged to interpret restlessness as motivation, comparison as ambition, and constant striving as proof of seriousness. In that environment, Epicurus feels almost radical. He asks a simpler and more dangerous question. What if the good life requires less, not more? That question exposes something uncomfortable. A great deal of what people call progress is not progress toward peace, but progress toward more sophisticated forms of anxiety. More possessions require more maintenance. More status creates more fear of losing it. More visibility produces more dependence on approval. The external signs of success often intensify the very instability they were supposed to solve. Epicurus is right to challenge that. But the problem emerges when tranquility becomes not just a corrective, but a governing principle strong enough to judge every form of striving. Because once peace becomes the highest standard, the philosophy begins to treat disturbance itself as suspect, even when that disturbance is connected to something valuable. This becomes especially visible in ambition. Ambition is often shallow, driven by ego or insecurity, but not always. Sometimes ambition is the refusal to remain smaller than your capacity. It is the willingness to endure discomfort in pursuit of something difficult and worthwhile. It creates instability, yes, but that instability is not necessarily a failure. It can be the structure through which growth happens. Epicurus tends to interpret that instability as a threat. He is concerned with protecting the mind from unnecessary agitation, and ambition almost always produces agitation. It introduces uncertainty, frustration, and dependence on outcomes that are not guaranteed. From the perspective of tranquility, reducing ambition looks rational. But from the perspective of development, it can look like premature retreat. Because not all peace is wisdom. Sometimes peace is simply the absence of challenge. Sometimes it is the result of lowering the stakes until disappointment becomes less likely. You protect yourself from frustration by wanting less, expecting less, risking less. That can create calm, but it can also create a life that is carefully defended rather than fully lived. This is where the philosophy begins to narrow possibility. You become increasingly skilled at removing sources of disturbance, but less willing to enter situations where disturbance is the price of significance. Relationships become something to manage rather than surrender to. Work becomes something to stabilize rather than something to be transformed by. Commitment becomes measured by how well it preserves peace rather than by how deeply it asks something of you. There is a subtle danger here. When tranquility becomes the highest good, you can start treating intensity itself as a mistake. You begin to interpret emotional risk as poor judgment, deep attachment as vulnerability, conflict as evidence that you chose badly. But some of the strongest forms of meaning come precisely from those unstable experiences. Love is not peaceful in the Epicurean sense. It produces fear, grief, uncertainty, dependence, and often pain. Yet few people would say that a life protected from all of that is therefore richer. The disturbance is part of the meaning. To care deeply is to accept that your peace is no longer entirely under your control. If your philosophy is built primarily around protecting that control, then it will always struggle to account for why such vulnerability is worth choosing. The same applies to moral responsibility. To take something seriously enough to fight for it is rarely tranquil. Justice, loyalty, responsibility, these do not always preserve calm. They often require discomfort, confrontation, sacrifice. A life organized entirely around minimizing disturbance may remain stable, but stability alone does not tell you whether the life is admirable. This is where Epicurus can feel insufficient. He is excellent at diagnosing false suffering, the suffering created by vanity, excess desire, and needless comparison. But he is less convincing when dealing with necessary suffering, the kind that emerges from devotion, principle, or the refusal to live superficially. Not all pain is an error. Some pain is evidence that you're involved in something real. And once you recognize that tranquility can no longer function as the final measure of value, it becomes one good among others, important but not absolute. Peace matters, but so do purpose, love, courage, and a willingness to endure instability for something that justifies it. A philosophy that protects peace at the expense of those things may save you from misery, but it may also save you from the full weight of being alive. That is where Epicurus stops being simple. He is not the philosopher of pleasure people imagine. He is the philosopher of careful limits, of disciplined desire, of protecting the mind from avoidable suffering. But if those limits become too central, the protection can turn into reduction, and life begins to shrink around the goal of staying undisturbed. The deepest issue with Epicurus is not that he valued pleasure too much, but that he defined the good life too heavily in terms of protection. His philosophy is built around reducing unnecessary suffering, and that instinct is understandable. Fear, anxiety, endless desire, and the constant instability created by comparison can destroy a person long before any physical hardship does. In that sense, Epicurus offers something genuinely important. He reminds you that peace is not laziness, and that simplicity can be a form of intelligence rather than failure. But protection is not the same as fulfillment. A life can be safe, calm, and psychologically stable while still feeling incomplete. You can remove many forms of suffering and still be left with the sense that something essential is missing. Because the human problem is not only how to avoid pain, it is also how to justify existence in a way that makes pain worth carrying when it arrives. Epicurus answers the first question far better than the second. He tells you how to live with less fear, less dependency, and less artificial desire. He teaches you to stop chasing illusions that promise happiness while multiplying dissatisfaction. He helps you distinguish what is necessary from what is merely socially rewarded. All of that is valuable, and much of modern life would improve if people took it seriously. But once tranquility becomes the highest measure, the philosophy starts to flatten the difference between a peaceful life and a meaningful one. Because meaning is rarely neutral. It involves attachment, and attachment creates vulnerability. It involves commitment, and commitment creates risk. It involves choosing things that can wound you precisely because they matter enough to be worth that cost. If your framework treats disturbance primarily as something to minimize, then it becomes difficult to explain why anyone should willingly choose a life that is emotionally harder. Yet people do this constantly. They choose children knowing it will create anxiety and grief. They choose love knowing it creates dependence and loss. They choose difficult work, moral responsibility, and long commitments that disrupt peace because those things make life feel substantial. They do not do it because they misunderstand happiness. They do it because happiness alone is not the final measure of a life. This is where Epicurus becomes too narrow. He assumes that once unnecessary suffering is removed, tranquility will reveal itself as the obvious good. But human beings often move in the opposite direction. They voluntarily accept instability, effort, and emotional cost because they're searching for significance, not just comfort. They are willing to trade peace for purpose when the purpose feels real enough. That does not make them irrational. It means that the architecture of value is larger than pleasure and pain. Some things are worth doing even when they make life harder. Some losses are worth risking because the alternative is emotional safety without depth. A philosophy that cannot account for that will always feel incomplete, no matter how elegantly it protects the mind. There's also a political and social dimension to this. Epicurus often recommends withdrawal from public ambition and unnecessary conflict. In a world dominated by vanity and competition, that restraint makes sense. But if taken too seriously, it can turn wisdom into retreat. You stop participating not because participation is meaningless, but because it threatens tranquility. You preserve inner peace, but at the cost of disengaging from the larger structures that shape human life. Sometimes peace requires withdrawal, but sometimes responsibility requires involvement. There are injustices that disturb peace because they should disturb it. There are moments where stepping back is not wisdom, but avoidance. If the highest goal is always serenity, then the philosophy can make moral seriousness look like a form of unnecessary suffering rather than a necessary burden. That is a serious limitation, because a good life is not only private, it is also relational, ethical, and historical. It includes obligations that do not always preserve comfort. It asks what kind of person you're willing to be when peace and principle come into conflict. Epicurus gives a strong answer to how to survive desire. He gives a weaker answer to how to live for something larger than yourself. That is why the common image of him as a philosopher of indulgence misses the real point entirely. His danger is not excess, but reduction. He does not tempt you into pleasure. He tempts you into building a life so carefully protected from pain that it also becomes protected from intensity, sacrifice, and transformative commitment. The wiser position is not to reject his insight, but to place it in proportion. Peace matters. Simplicity matters. Freedom from unnecessary desire matters. But tranquility should be a foundation, not the summit. It should make deeper forms of life possible, not replace them. You need enough calm to think clearly, enough stability to avoid being ruled by fear, enough restraint to separate real needs from manufactured ones. But after that, the question changes. Not how do I stay undisturbed, but what is worth being disturbed for? That is the question Epicurus cannot fully answer. And that is why he did not mean what most people think, but also why even his real meaning is not enough on its own.